Lacho Dzives. Hello, everyone. My name is Anna Mirga Kruszelnicka, and you're listening to the podcast Echoes of Memory. Today, we are going to discuss a significant topic: the power of names, Roma victims, and the struggle for recognition. When we open history books or official documents, we often see Roma Holocaust represented only in numbers. This many Roma were killed, this many Roma were deported. But these numbers are anonymous. And as Stalin once said, uncomfortably, but truthfully, the death of one man is a tragedy, and the death of a million is a statistic. That is why in Holocaust education we need to move from numbers to names, and from statistics to stories. And there is another moral dimension to this. During the Holocaust, Roma were stripped of their identities. Their names were erased, they were turned into numbers, and even those numbers were sometimes recycled after their death. And this erasure of identity was central to the Nazi project of dehumanization. Today, when we teach or speak about the Roma Holocaust, we must resist repeating this erasure. We must bring back the names, the stories, and the personal histories. Today, I'm accompanied by three brilliant Roma: Lisa Smith, Brett Ola, and Anzelika Bielova. And together we will ask ourselves, why do the names matter? How does our understanding of history shift when we focus on victims and survivors' stories? And what strategies can we use to build a polyphonic memory with Roma voices at the center? Now, before we start, I would like to ask each of you to briefly introduce yourselves. Maybe we start with you, Angelika.
Thank you. I'm Angelika Belova. I'm from Ukraine, originally from city of Zaporizhia. I'm Roma feminist and human rights activist.
Thank you. Lisa?
My name is Lisa Smith and I'm a Romani filmmaker. We have a production company called Patron Films, and this was created really out of a frustration for the lack of accurate on-screen representation of Romani people in the UK. And alongside this, I serve as a research associate at Heidelberg University in the Institute for Anti-Gypsyism in Film.
Thank you, Lisa. Welcome. Brett?
Hi, my name's Brett. I'm 22 years old. I come straight from the south of Slovakia. I'm an artist, art director, but nowadays I focus on human rights and on the rights of us, Roma people, trying to bring it more close to our people and to make some changes to recognize our history and also to build a legacy and to bring a better future for all of us.
Thank you, Brett. Thank you all. We're very excited to have all three of you. Okay, so let's begin with the basic question. What do we lose when we talk about Roma Holocaust only through the lens of anonymous statistics? And what changes when we actually shift this perspective to look at individual names and stories?
So, first of all, when we are speaking about the real stories, the real people, when we are listening the testimonies of the survivors, we are turning the statistics into the real names, and we are turning to humanity, to the empathy, and we are advocating, we are making visible the history of our community, the history of our families. And for example, now I came here to tell the story of my own family, because they also went through the Second World War, and they also hid behind their home in the hall because of the Nazis. And our important role as a human rights activist, as a young Roma, it is to make these stories vocal, to remind about our history, and because it was vanished for a long, long time.
Yes, that's very powerful to bring the stories from your own experiences to
Correct.
counter this erasure.
Everything important was said to this, but maybe I would just add that when we see those numbers, we don't realize like that those numbers are actually someone's babies, maybe parents, maybe kids, sisters, brothers, and that they went through life as we go through on daily basis. They lived, and they are not just numbers. And when you listen to a good song and you feel it and you start crying, have you ever felt that? How can you feel that through a number or through a statistic? You cannot. But if you listen to a story and you listen to the struggle and listen to how they survived and all the pain they went through, it just builds up a legacy in you, and it just builds up a good feeling about resisting and opposing the struggles that we still have and still have to endure, and we get the power and gain from them. For me, it helps me a lot in daily life when I remind myself that okay, we had a lot of harder times before, and that they went through and they still found a mood to sing, to dance, to celebrate life even after all those horrible things. So that just keeps me pushing, and I don't think that numbers can do that, but individual stories of people, of their lives, can really move us.
That's completely right. Lisa?
I think the power of singular stories opposed to statistics are so much more powerful because it shifts the narrative from us being almost passive victims to being real people with agency and resilience and resistance. And I think that's the importance of moving statistics to numbers, statistics to stories. In my own work over the last years, I focused on creating an animated documentary series that tells the stories of 7 different Holocaust survivors from different parts of Europe. And this whole project actually came about because the Foundation Memorial in Berlin recognized that there was just this focus on the perpetrators, their names, and the numbers of the Romani people that suffered, but no lived realities, no human experiences that were visible. And then that's what sent on the path to create these stories. I really believe in the power of film as a tool for sharing information and knowledge, and I think we need to reconnect back to our roots as Romani people. We're rooted in an oral culture, an oral tradition of storytelling, and through my work, I try to find more contemporary ways of transferring those stories into films where larger audiences can hear and see the stories, because I think there are so many stories of resistance that have been unrecognized, unacknowledged, and in many cases probably still undocumented in archives, locked away or hidden. So I think it has to happen for a transformative shift in the narrative on how Romani people are perceived during this time. There needs to be a new way of dealing with this.
Absolutely. I think there's one interesting thing also, Lisa, you mentioned about the archives, because in fact, much of what we know about Roma Holocaust history or Holocaust history in general is through the archives and the materials created by the perpetrators. And of course, these documents already carry bias. They use racist language, they are full of stereotypes, and this is one of the most dominant sources of knowledge of the Holocaust. So how can we challenge and overcome this symbolic violence of these materials through the voices of the victims? What is the role for us to bring this more intimate, subjective perspectives of Roma? You mentioned storytelling, oral history, but there are also songs, there are artworks. How can we use different sources as kind of vehicles for challenging this perspective of the perpetrators?
I'd like to say about one of examples. This year in Ukraine, in Kiev, our Roma organization and our great partners from ARCA, they organized a really great memorial event on 2nd of August. And they invited to this event a lot of people, like high-level officials, diplomats, CSOs, civil society organizations, and to pay attention to this day, Memorial Day, Day of the Memory of Roma Holocaust. And it is really crucial to gather around as much more allies that we can, because with those people we can achieve, in this way we can achieve the remembrance of the history of Roma. And for us, it was really the first time when Roma organization organized such event. And they also have done the exhibition with the real stories of people from Ukraine. And it was like pictures of these people and the stories, like a storytelling. And in this way, I saw people's faces when they read these stories, and a lot of them were crying. And it is what we have to do to invite, the empathy, to build these bridges, to make the history, and to make voices of our grandparents alive and loud. I think it is this is our responsibility.
I think as well it's about us reflecting on the Nazi terminology that we still use, that's still prolific, I guess, and also in the Romani movement on how we use language. For example, I see August the 2nd is still promoted by some organizations, Roma and non-Roma, across Europe as the liquidation of the gypsy camp. And when we're using words like liquidation, this is Nazi terminology that exists. So it's a case of how are we reflecting as a movement on our own use of this Nazi vocabulary, and what can that be exchanged with that's empowering Roma and is actually us owning that and owning that history. So I do think that we need to look at the terminology and be aware of that we use almost unconsciously sometimes when we're looking at the history of the Roma Holocaust.
Yes, that's a very important point, because it's true that we reproduce sometimes unconsciously, not only the language, but also the imagery.
In my mind, when I think about this topic or this question, the first thing that pops up for me is hope, because that's the way we can change how people see us. Because I think still in any type of medium like art or music or even in television, we are still very much the same. We have the same look that the Nazis gave us. We still live the lives on those mediums like screening or in the songs that is not real anymore. Maybe it was, but it's not real. It's not happening right now. Me as an artist, I fight with it every day that yes, I want to show how we do today, but I don't want to get into those old stereotypes that I don't know if they're our, or maybe maybe they was some time ago, but who knows who created them on us, you know. And that's what's really important for us, to show the real side, show the true stories, and to open the perspective of people. Because also in Slovakia, as in other parts of the world, the big problem is that racism comes from childhood, from the family table, that they see us the way their grandparents saw us, but it's because they didn't see anything else, you know. A lot of my friends were actually openly racist before they got to know me, and our culture is not shown in full beauty. So that's why the hope there is for me to show the real side of our lives and our daily basis, and to get rid of those old patterns.
I think you're totally right. I mean, for centuries, really, it was the others who were in control over the narratives, the images, the texts, all the cultural content really about us was created without our input, without our control over it. So it's now we're moving to the times when we really want to build a critical mass of content, of interpretations, of images, of cultural products that can really convey our own experiences and our own histories from our own Romani standpoint, from our own perspective. So this is really important. But of course, we mentioned that the archives are this source of knowledge, and somehow we still replicate even these images and stereotypes and the language of the perpetrators. But our challenge now is that we're moving, unfortunately, to the era after the survivors' times, right? I mean, there's very few survivors left. So what is the role for young people, for us to try to recover from erasure, from oblivion, some of those personal stories, testimonies of those who lived during this time and their families? What can we do?
We can just widen the perspective of people, we can show them how we really live, and maybe they will understand, like, I'm not here to put a put a thought into someone's mind. It's totally up to them what they think about us, but it is our job to show them us in the right light, and not just in the old shadow.
And what you said really resonated with me because I had similar experiences. People would say, but you're not like the rest, are you? You know, you're an exception. And and
So much.
and what does that mean? Like in from which perspective that they come in to us with? And I think there's just a complete lack of accurate representation of us in mainstream media. When I was growing up, I remember being in school and we had teachings around the Holocaust, and it was completely erased. There was no perspective at all or no information about actually Romani persecution during that time. And I think widely within the world now, the Roma Holocaust is still not widely known. And a lot of people come at it from a really baseline amount of knowledge. And I think, like, as young people, we've got so many technologies at our hands now that other young people previously to us didn't have. I mean, like different social media platforms, different ways of making films, different ways of preserving those testimonies from our own families. And I think that's probably key. And something key that we can do is to use these contemporary ways and these pieces of technology to preserve, because that's what it's about, right? It's preserving our collective cultural memories around this time that have been in the main erased and not visible. But it's a big beast, isn't it? You know, mainstream media, and
is,
how do we deal with
and
that and
it's
handle that?
and it's hard for us Roma people to, because we first have to recognize what's real and what's not. We have to recognize what was put on us and what's fake, and to recognize that only way there is education, listening to our elders, to the testimonies, listening to how they lived, and to also broader our perspective, like not just look one way, because us Roma people have this saying that goes like, uh, what God gives, it will be, which is a way that we've been living through centuries. And I don't think that it is really good in these times that we're living right now. We should take the action in hands and not accept what's happening, and to really fight for it. But I mean, if you're gonna just sit at home and just consume the things that they give you, then you're not gonna make a change. You have to take it to your hands and really sit down behind that table and really go deep inside yourself and deep inside your history to see what's real and to see what's beneath the surface and to bring it up.
Yeah, I'd like to add something to your speech, Lisa, because you said about the awareness raising. And I have one example. I was invited to one of the event for women leaders on 2nd of August. And right after the memorial event in Babin Yar, it is a memorial park in Kyiv, I went to this event to give a speech about my leadership, about my organization Voice of Romani, and I started my speech with 1 minute of silence in the memory of the victims of Roma Holocaust, and I told to people the story of Roma Holocaust. And after this event, a lot of people came to me, and they were journalists. And they said that they didn't know about this. And I think that it is really crucial for us to, we have to accept the fact that in policies, in education, in information awareness raising, a lot of politicians didn't do anything to remember and to save this history of Roma Holocaust. But we, as an activist, as young Roma leaders, we have to speak about that, speak through our personal stories, and on a different levels, on regional level, on national level, international level. And I think this is our huge responsibility. And I would say also that it is really important to have politicians Roma politicians who also can push this agenda and remind the story. Because, for example, in the context of Ukraine, we are part of the story of Ukraine, and we and our Roma minority was also in Babin Yar, where it was killed more than 20,000 people. And it is really important to make these stories a part of the culture of the country in which you are living, and to speak about that honestly, and to make this like our general multicultural story. Because I agree, and I think our countries, it is really multicultural countries, and we are the part of this country.
And I think you mentioned, all of you actually mentioned that part of, us being part of the society, contributing, being integral to stories, cultures, even languages of our national, countries where we live or where we come from. And I think that there are so many inspiring stories of outstanding Roma individuals from this period of Second World War, both victims and survivors. And these stories are often so powerful, teachings about bravery, about kindness, about strength, ingenuity, survival. Those are stories that are so inspiring for me, at least. I'm thinking of people like Alfreda Markowska Noncia. I come from Poland, and she was a Polish Romni who saved over 50 children, Roma, but also Jewish and Polish children, from the most horrific conditions, risking her own life, and raising these children or finding families for them. I'm thinking of Raymond Gruyem, one of the biggest icons, I think, of Roma Holocaust history, who was a French Roma Holocaust survivor and also member of French resistance, fighting not only for the well-being of his community, his family, of the Roma, but also of all the French people, of all the Europeans. So, there are so many stories out there. I'd like to ask you to share stories from your communities, your countries, of people who have moved you, inspired you.
I would like to start with my family. I brought some pictures, and it is really a family reliquary for us. This is my grandparents, Andriy and Praskovia. And they lived in Zaporizhia. They settled, so they met each other when they lived in a nomadic way of life, and then they settled together in Zaporizhia and bought a house, private house, and it was the beginning of the 20th century. And when the Second World War started, Nazis occupied our city. And I know all the story because my granny, she is 87 years old, and she told me about all of this. And she was 7 years old when the Second World War started, and she remembered everything. And she told me this story. When the Nazis came, our family had agriculture. So it was a lot of horses because my grandfather, he was working with the horses and selling it to the army also. And we had pigs, we had chickens, and etc. And it was very attractive for the Nazis and for those who occupied Zaporizhia. And they came to our house, and all my family, they were hiding near behind the house in the hall. And it is really important to say that my family had a really good relations with the neighbors. They have a really multicultural like district in Zaporizhia, and they also had Jews. They had like Ukrainians, Roma people there, and they warned each other if they know that Nazis is coming. Because of the agriculture and because of the house, the Nazi came to our house and lived there, and my family were hiding. And then when our soldiers came to the occupied Zaporizhia, my granny said that it was so, she was so scared and happy at the same time, because um, it was the occupation, it was like a winning, and she is saying that because they survived and because people were crying, and they were so happy, she is remembering it like in this kind of different emotions, and I would like to share one more story. It is a story about Ukrainian woman, and she was a wife of Roma man, and she lived with a Roma family, of course. She was a part of the family, and when the Nazis came, they took people outside of the house, and they prepared them to kill them. And they said to this woman, Ukrainian woman, not to go with them because she is Ukrainian, she is not Roma. But she stayed together with them, and they killed her and the whole family. It is like a stories not only about the resistance, not only about the surviving, it is also stories for me about the importance of our joint story. And it is important to remember that, and not to exclude Roma community and Roma minority inside our countries. Because, for example, my community, we are Servi. It is like a Ukrainian Roma who have roots from Serbia. And my grandparents, they lived in Ukraine like in 18th, 19th century. That what I can see in the archives, and we are the part of our joint history. And this is important bridge for me, which we have to build to fight with stereotypes, with the excluding of Roma, and to achieve the dignity life of our community.
Thank you so much for sharing this story. This is really so powerful, and there's so many, I think, amazing themes that resonate through your story, and so many different aspects that really dismantle multiple stereotypes about Roma. Roma being, sedentary for centuries, owning land, working the land, and being in good relationships like a family as part of that region. I think this is so powerful to show exactly this part of the story, and I felt also very moved by this anecdote of the this family that had a non-Roma woman living with them, and how you fight for dignity, really, of your own life, even in the face of death. This is really very powerful. Thank you for sharing. How about you, Brett? I'm sure you also have interesting stories to tell.
There is one story that I would like to mention because it happened in the city where I live. It's Lučenec, and actually during our first Slovak state, when Jozef Tiso was our president, when he was in a close collaboration with the Nazi. So there was this story of this small girl that she was living in a railway near the railways in Lučenec, which were the first in Slovakia that deported actually Jews into concentration camps. And this girl's name is Elena Berkiova. I'm not sure if she's still alive, but we met her 3 years ago, and she's a really powerful woman, always laughing. But when she told us her story, I mean, I couldn't sleep for some time because what happened to her was that the Nazi came into her house, they took her dad and the other 6 men from the community. They told them that they are gonna take him to work in Zvolen. But in Zvolen, what was happening actually that the men were working first, building roads and making highways and all of that that the Nazi people needed from us, and then they made them dig their own grave and shot them and put them in their own grave that they just digged, and nobody knew about it. There is only one testimony of one person from Slovakia who saw it from the attic, what things were happening, and many children and women had to go through their graves, dig up their skeletons, and they had to recognize them only by clothes or by teeth. And one of the victims was Elena's father, and she was talking about how the Nazis came and they went after the local priest, and he could have saved them just by one paper signing that they didn't help the partisans, which they did by bringing them food, which I don't think is a big crime. It's not a crime at all, but during that time it was. But he denied uh, helping them, and later it was this priest that closed up the marriage of Elena and her husband, even though he didn't help her family to survive. And Elena told us actually what I bring with myself everywhere I go, that it's first of all on you. I mean, I'm really thankful, and I wouldn't be here if those people around me wouldn't help me and support me and give love. But first of all, it's always you. So you have to take the action. And it's hard for me to talk about right now also, but there is so much stories that are still hidden because first of all, many people don't want to open up and speak about it, but the second thing, which is the biggest problem, is no one asks them.
There's so much, I think, in the stories that you shared for us to unpack and, I mean, digest, even there.
It was the Slovakia was during the Nazi regime a really big problem because the Nazi soldiers could do anything they wanted because of Tiso. And I remember my grandmother was telling me, because her husband was taken to the SS army because we were under the occupation of Hungary on the south of Slovakia, so we had to fight in the SS army, and they had to hide in the basement for 2 months. My grandmother actually, and there were six sisters, and they were without food or sunlight for 2 months because the Nazi regime was walking around the small town that I live in. So yeah, there are so much stories that I could be here for days and talk about it, but
You're totally right. And also, there's all these stories of survival. They are also stories of bravery and heroism. Sometimes we take it for granted, but, the acts of heroism sometimes are very small. We think about heroes sometimes in the superhero mode, but really, the act of kindness, the act of sharing food with someone.
yeah, you give someone food and then you get shot because of it.
And in fact, there's many stories of Roma who were not only part of resistance movement, partisans like Raymond on your T-shirt, but also many Roma were helping the partisan movement by providing them food, by sharing information, for example, through how to move through the forest or where to find food, or smuggling weapons, sharing information because we have such extended networks, family networks, connections, and knowledge of the landscape. So all of these stories are really important for us to recover and remember, and to say the names of those people, to give them back their dignity, their life stories, and then learn through them. Lisa, what about you? What are some of those stories that move you?
One that I wasn't going to mention, but what you said was really moved me. And as well, it raises this question about how to deal with the stories of those who never survived, and actually no family members survived. Who tells their stories and how do they go on? And it reminds me of one of the biographies I worked with on this animated documentary series, and it was the hardest one for me because it was the only one that featured a story about a child. And this little boy was called Adam Uvari, from the Uvari family who lived in Halbturn. Um, and none of the family survived this. And Adam was the last to be murdered in Vienna Children's Hospital through euthanasia, as many Romani children did face that. And the only reason why his story came to light about the family was because there was a historian who lived in the same town, Halbturn, who, for some reason, uncovered the Uvari family's name. And then he went on a mission of years' work to build up and establish what actually happened to the family members. There was the mom and dad and 3 sisters as well as him. And he started to build up documentation of the family's history, how they lived, the concentration camps that they were all sent to. And then he passed this information on to the foundation for one of these animations to be created. And I think if that man hadn't just got in his head then that connection, that family story would never be known. Adam's story would never be known. And I guess it's not just about the singular story, but the story it represents and how many other people that happened to. When the story I wanted to share with you today was about Matteo Maximov. I spent 3-4 months researching his life, and I had a challenge to create a 7-minute documentary that captured such a rich life, you know, from birth to the end. But I chose this because I think, like when we talk about narratives or stories from this time, it's so easy to see them in isolation, and we only look at people's lives during this one period of time. We don't look at how they lived, what they were like before, or actually how they survived and lived their lives afterwards. And I guess with Matteo Maximoff, you know, he when he was a teenager, he used to read 500 pages a day by candlelight in the camp that he was living in. And he used to read so many books, and he used to like to look at how authors of the 19th century described and wrote about Romani characters, Romani people, but without actually knowing him. And he said, right, I've got an opportunity because I can read, I can write, I can do something to change this. And that's what he did. And he ended up being one of the most prolific Romani prose authors in the world. But actually, life was never set out for him that way. And he had a lot of odds stacked up against him. Like his ancestors on his father's side were Calderash from Romania, and they earned their living as coppersmiths. But they were formerly slaves, like property of the crown there. And then his mother was a Catholic Manouche from France. Yeah, and his mother died when he was 8, and then his father when he was 14. But it was really his great grandmother who took care of him in a camp called the Zone on the edge of Paris. And there he just worked as coppersmith with his uncles, but he was surrounded by great, great storytellers. But he never even spent a day in his life in school. His father, before he died, taught him the alphabet and how to read, and then the numbers, you know. Um, so he really wasn't destined to become such a prolific writer in the early days. And then there was a family dispute that imprisoned him. Um, and his lawyer asked him to write a description about what happened for his defense plea. But then, in true Maximoff fashion, instead of just giving a statement about this happened, that happened, he wrote a novel. And this was the Les Ossatori, which went on to become one of his most famous works. And during the time, actually, it was 4 months and he was finally released from prison. But when he was waiting for the publication of his book, it's when France declared war with Germany in the autumn of 1939. And like hatred towards nomadic people was growing and growing. And then on August 8th in 1940, it was finally when the French gendarmes confiscated the family's papers and drove Maximoff with all of his family to the wet and windy plateau of Lamazon. And in this camp, there was no electricity or water, and most people were living under sheets with branch forks to hold it together, to separate them from the cold and wet frozen earth. And hunger and disease quickly spread through the camp. And the first victim that Maximoff remembers was a child, and he wasn't even 1 year old. So he speaks a lot about this. And when I worked on this biography, it was important for me to go through all of his memoirs. And what I did was, because it was a narrated story, I went through all of his memoirs and then selected all of the bits of information that he'd said at different points throughout his life to weave together this story or this portrait about who he was. And during his time in Lamazon, because he was one of the only people who could read and write, he wrote countless letters, like letter beyond letter beyond letter, to the mayor of Lamazon, and some reached him. And through this is really where we start to see Maximoff using the power of like the written word as a tool for survival. And through that, he managed to get his whole extended family moved from the camp to an unfinished hospital. And I think, like, for me, I think, wow, to be able to have done that, and for obviously the mayor to agree as well, was something that was pretty unheard of. But this created like a rage inside him, because a lot of people in France weren't released from these camps up until 1946. So he took it on himself to go to the daily newspapers and try and publish as many articles as possible. And he was one of the first people to describe and denounce the Romani genocide. Romani genocide, the Roma Holocaust. And he's one of the people responsible for this number that we have of 500,000. Like now we know, okay, it's not accurate, many more documented. But at that time, that was significant in actually giving an estimate on the number of the actual death toll. And there was a quote that he said after the war. He said, "My people are freer than before, but we still have many hurdles ahead." I always came to the conclusion that we can only truly liberate ourselves through our culture and through our religion. And I've spent the rest of my life spreading the word of God as a preacher of the evangelical mission. I hesitated for a long time whether to tell stories, scary stories, but I'm convinced it would be such a great loss if our rich folklore and the stories of our ancestors were lost. And this for me was interesting because it was a contradiction in Maximov's personality, that he was completely dedicated to preserving Romani folklore and Romani history, even at the expense of his religion as a pastor of the evangelical church, a leader in that position. And at that point also, people weren't allowed a TV, but he absolutely refused and he went against this, and he had a TV, you know? So he never compromised his culture or his people for the religion that he took up, which I find really interesting. For the rest of his life, he was really politically active. He was part of the 1971 World Romani Congress that we know was the start of worldwide political movement for Roma rights. He was one of the main translators there. And I guess I'll wrap it up, but he had a literary career that spanned more than 60 years with 9 short novels, lots of collections of stories, and he really recognized like the power of the written word as a form of resistance, and he did use it as survival in his earlier years. Like I reflect and think he died in 1999 in an apartment in Paris, and this apartment, I've seen like the images, documentaries that followed him at that time, and it was completely hoarded, packed of kilometers of film roll that he'd spent traveling 32 different countries trying to preserve like this Romani collective cultural memory. He even went to India to try and figure out the origins of the Romani language, but thousands of photographs. So he really dedicated his life to preserving like the collective cultural memories, which I find fascinating. But then after he died, it wasn't actually until 2010 that the French government recognized, Roma as victims of these racist crimes against the Vichy regime. So it was a very long time until actually Romani people were formally acknowledged for the persecution that happened to them.
Thank you,
Great.
Lisa, for sharing the
Now
story.
that's inspiring, but I don't want to like prolong this question, but I have to just say one thing that really comes to my mind when I was listening to the story about, and it is that how could I just not choose to do the right thing when there were people like this powerful before? Because now we have the chance to show it. Now we have the chance. It is easy for us to show. I mean, not that easy, but it is a lot easier. So for me to just sit at home and just do nothing about it would be very foolish from me, and it would be such a dishonor for all these people. So that's why I think these stories have to be told and have to be shown, and they have to be put into those minds of people, Roma or non-Roma. I don't care. Just tell them to people, because this is where you get the inspiration from in life to move forward what you want. Because now we live in a very comfortable life. We don't have to move a finger or anything. People don't care, and especially in our community, with Roma community, this is very true, that they don't care about what will be or what was, and it is very wrong, because we should fight and fight and fight, because it's a disgrace and a dishonor of the people who fought for our rights, for us to live like we live now.
I think, these stories do not only show trauma, but they also show this incredible strength, the resilience and the resistance of these people who lived in those horrific times. And not only during the war, but then after the war, they came back to their homes, their countries, their communities, and they many times had to face the same hostile societies, the same oppressive structures, sometimes even the same Nazi people in the same public offices as during the war. So, I think that this resilience and the creativity of finding always a way to move forward and to thrive despite all these obstacles, despite all the hate. This is something that also moves me tremendously. And I think all these stories that you shared actually showed this exactly, this survival strategies of resistance, of resilience. And I wonder what stands out for you in terms of the strategies that they employed to survive. Anything that you find most, I don't know, inspiring, courageous, or I don't know, just surprising?
I think what's common among these stories is that everyone followed their heart. It's a big thing that nowadays we are too much like, I don't feel so good, I'm not gonna go off the apartment. I don't feel so good, so I'm not gonna do this, not gonna do this. They didn't care about how they felt at the moment. They felt horrible, but if they would just sit in place, they would die. Simple as that. Like, it was live or die.
I'd like to continue because I live in Ukraine and I am this person who know what is this war. And I think, and my grandparents and our families in Ukraine, we are doing all in the way of love to our families, because of course I'd like to for my kids to be in a safe place, and the family, it is like part of Romanipe, it is part of our Roma culture, and this is the first priority every time. And when my family and when my grandparents were hiding behind the house in this hall, they were trying to survive and to protect their families, and this is the most important. And of course I think in the way when we are living, I'm living in Ukraine, and I know that a lot of Roma soldiers currently in the armed forces in Ukraine, and my relatives in the Second World War also was a part of the army and a Roma family. So it was an aunt of my granny, and it was an uncle of my granny who was the part of the army. And it is important to understand again, I'm emphasizing this message that we are parts of our cultures and parts of our countries. And it is really crucial for me to emphasize that Roma people are also soldiers. They served in the armed forces in Ukraine. And if I may, I would like to share one story of one guy. It is Albert Brugos, and he is a part of armed forces in Ukraine, and he joined it in 2014 when Russia occupied Donbass, Donetsk, partially Donetsk and Lugansk region, and he joined then in NATO, anti-terroristic operation. And now, when the full-scale invasion started, he also served armed forces, and he had a cancer. And he is still in armed forces of Ukraine because he's fighting for her own country, for his own country, and this is crucial to understand that. And of course, we have to understand that only love to our families, our country, it is part of our resilience, of our resistance in the Second World War, and now in Ukraine, also for Roma community.
Thank you so much, Angelica, for bringing this perspective. You're totally right. I mean, those stories of Holocaust, of our communities that happened before, they are somehow, coming back in the context that we're living now in the war in Ukraine. For all we know, you will be also considered a Holocaust survivor because you are living in a place where there is war happening. You're actively taking place. You're doing civil society work. You're also spreading the message. So, I think it's really important that you make us realize and land this conversation where we reflect back on the past and we see how it really.
Now, unfortunately, these things about which you just said, about conflict-related sexual violence, about the raping women, about killing of this people, of the civilians, everything is going on now in Ukraine. And after the if we will if we will achieve the just peace for Ukraine, and when we will face for sure when the war will finish, we will face with a lot of stories, with a lot of such stories, unfortunately, and with a lot of people also from Roma national minority in Ukraine who were killed, because in Donetsk region it was one of the biggest Roma community. In my hometown in Zaporizhia, we had a story of one Roma woman who was killed by the Russian missile in the center of Zaporizhia. It hit directly her house. Unfortunately, the story of the war and the story of the massive killings is going on again and again.
And it will be, I think that I am the fourth or fifth generation after war, and I'm very used to living in peace in Slovakia because there was no war since the Second World War, and even in the Second World War there were no active battles, at least in the region where I live. And for us it is just a normal thing that there is no war and killing and all these horrific things happening, but they can happen so fast and so easily. And that's what we don't have to forget, that it can happen anytime to any one of us. That's why we have to keep telling ourselves these stories and take example, and to not make the mistakes that they made in the past, because we can learn from them, and we can also learn from the great things that they did. And I think that's the main problem, that we forget that it's for me in Slovakia we say that war is at the border because it's happening in Ukraine, and still people are there living like, oh no, there no war is going on, but it can happen anytime, any day. And then what will happen? We will be still in the same, like, oh, I don't have the mood to go out to the front. No, there are people with cancer fighting because they love their country, and for me to just sit at home because my mood is not right or because my stomach hurts and to not do anything, I think it's very selfish.
You're totally right. We learned so much from these stories of the past that inform us really today. And hopefully peace will come soon, and our future generations will be able to live in a world where there is no war. But we have to be continuously aware, and we have to feel inspired by these stories. Thank you all for this powerful discussion. Today we saw that the numbers alone cannot carry the depth of human suffering or the strength of human spirit and the strength of human resilience. Names matter because they restore dignity, and stories matter because they build empathy and recognition. And as we continue to teach, research, and commemorate the Roma Holocaust, let us remember every number is a name and every statistic was once a life. So let's also remember that it's still going on today, and we need to remember the brave people, both in the past and today, fighting for peace. Thank you all for joining us today for this conversation, Angelika, Lisa, Brett. And to you, dear audience, thank you for listening. If this conversation resonates with you, share this content, leave a like, leave a comment, follow and subscribe the ERIAC channels, and be part of the movement shifting the discourse. Thank you.